9 Golden Age stars critics said were terrible actors. They were the faces that defined an era. Beautiful, glamorous, larger than life. And according to critics, some of the worst actors to ever cash a Hollywood paycheck. The dirty secret of the studio system wasn't finding talent, revealed a former MGM publicity director who worked through the 1950s. It was hiding the lack of it behind beautiful faces and expensive productions. Welcome to Hollywood's most carefully guarded scandal, the stars who couldn't act. We're not talking about occasional bad performances or early career missteps. We're talking about entire careers built on everything except acting ability. Stars who were savaged by critics, but pushed relentlessly by studios that knew exactly what they were selling, and it wasn't talent. My job wasn't directing her, confessed one Academy Award-winning filmmaker about a blonde bombshell on our list. My job was pointing her at the camera and praying she didn't mangle the dialogue too badly. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. These terrible performers weren't failures. They weren't relegated to B-movies or forgotten. They were A-list celebrities earning fortunes, dating fellow stars, and appearing on magazine covers worldwide. How is this possible? What system could turn critically reviled performers into international icons? And most importantly, why did audiences keep buying tickets to see people who, according to one critic, delivered lines with all the emotional depth of someone reading a grocery list? The answer reveals the most brilliant con job in entertainment history and why sometimes being a great actor was the least important qualification for becoming a Hollywood legend. But first, let's meet the woman whose physical measurements were printed in larger type than her name on movie posters, and whose acting was described by The New Yorker as a crime against dialogue.
His name sounds very influential. His name only so happens to be Rockwell Hunter. What do you do?
Jayne Mansfield, the bombshell who couldn't act. January 1957. A flashbulb explosion outside Grauman's Chinese Theater. Jayne Mansfield steps from her pink Cadillac, wearing a dress so tight it appears painted on her famous 40-21-35 figure. The crowd roars. Photographers scramble. Studio executives smile. Nobody cares that the New York Times had just called her performance an embarrassment to the craft of acting. Jayne was our nuclear option, a former 20th Century Fox publicist told me years later. When we needed publicity, we'd unleash her in a dress 2 sizes too small, and suddenly nobody remembered she couldn't act. And critics were absolutely merciless about her acting limitations. The Hollywood Reporter wrote that she confuses volume with emotion, giggling with comedy, and exposure with acting. Variety described her performance in The Girl Can't Help It as watching someone read phonetically in a language they don't understand. But here's where Mansfield's story gets fascinating. Unlike many on our list, she was completely self-aware about her limitations. Jayne knew exactly what she was selling, and it wasn't Shakespeare, recalled a cameraman who worked on multiple Mansfield films. During one particularly difficult scene, the director kept demanding more emotion. After the 10th take, Jayne looked him dead in the eye and said, "Honey, if they wanted emotion, they wouldn't have hired these," and pointed to her famous assets. Directors developed bizarre techniques to work around her limitations. Frank Tashlin, who directed her in multiple films, would demonstrate exactly how she should deliver each line, which she would then imitate precisely. It was like training a parrot, the cameraman continued. Tashlin would perform the scene, and Jayne would mimic his intonation, gestures, everything. Then they'd cut that together with reaction shots from the other actors, and you could create the illusion of a performance. But Mansfield's career wasn't just built on her figure, it was built on one of the greatest publicity machines in Hollywood history. Those accidental wardrobe malfunctions, carefully choreographed. The pink mansion with heart-shaped swimming pool, designed specifically to keep her in the headlines. While critics continued to savage her performances, Mansfield laughed all the way to the bank. At her peak, she was earning over $150,000 per film, equivalent to $1.5 million today, despite being considered, in the words of director George Cukor, a walking gimmick, and everyone knew it. Mansfield's tragic death at 34 in a car accident transformed her from punchline to legend, but the critical assessment of her acting never changed. She remains the perfect example of a star who succeeded, not despite her acting limitations, but by creating a persona so powerful that acting ability became irrelevant. But if Mansfield represented the female side of Hollywood's beauty over talent equation, our next subject showed that men could play the same game with even less ability.
Oh, I'm Tab Hunter. Did you know that mental illness claims more victims than any other?
Tab Hunter, Hollywood's beautiful empty vessel. Don't act, just react. That was the primary direction given to Tab Hunter throughout his early career, according to multiple directors who worked with him in the 1950s, and with good reason. With his 6'0" athletic build, wavy blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes, Hunter was Warner Bros.' answer to James Dean and Marlon Brando. There was just one devastating problem. He had the emotional range of a coffee table, recalled director Max Westfield. The camera absolutely loved him. Acting coaches absolutely gave up on him. The critical response to Hunter's early performances was so brutal, it became legendary in Hollywood circles. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times described his performance in Battle Cry as a handsome mannequin occasionally required to move its lips. Time magazine suggested that Hunter doesn't deliver lines, he survives them. But none of this mattered to teenage girls, who turned Hunter into one of the biggest heartthrobs of the 1950s. The studio calculated that each facial expression Tab could convincingly perform was worth about $500,000 at the box office, joked a former Warner Brothers publicist. By that math, his 3 expressions made him a very valuable property. The limitations became impossible to ignore when Hunter was cast in Damn Yankees in 1958. The role required singing, dancing, and portraying a man transformed from elderly to youthful by a demonic pact, challenges that exposed every weakness in Hunter's repertoire. Legendary choreographer Bob Fosse reportedly threw up his hands after 3 days of rehearsals, telling the producer, "I can teach anyone to dance, but I can't teach them to have a pulse." Yet Hunter's fame continued unabated. His single Young Love hit #1 on the Billboard charts. Fan magazines breathlessly covered his every move. Warner Brothers kept casting him in leading roles despite critical drubbings. The contrast between public adoration and critical assessment created a psychological toll that Hunter only revealed decades later. "Every morning I'd read reviews saying I was wooden, empty, a pretty face with nothing behind it," Hunter admitted in his candid 2005 autobiography. "Then I'd arrive at the studio where dozens of fan letters called me the greatest actor alive. It was schizophrenic." What makes Hunter's story particularly interesting is his late career revelation. In 2005, he finally acknowledged what Hollywood had long whispered. He was gay, forced to live a carefully constructed lie during his years as a teen heartthrob marketed to young women. "I wasn't just acting on screen," Hunter reflected. "I was acting every moment of my life." Perhaps this explains why critics sense something fundamentally inauthentic in his performances. Hunter wasn't just struggling with dialogue and emotion, he was trapped in a multi-layered performance that extended far beyond the camera. But while Hunter's limitations could be partially explained by the psychological burden he carried, our next subject's terrible acting came with no such extenuating circumstances. She was simply the most blatant example of a studio manufacturing a star with absolutely no concern for ability.
Greater Los Angeles Press Club,
right.
And he saw me in a bathing suit and signed me.
Mamie Van Doren. The bombshell assembly line goes too far. If Hollywood's star system was an assembly line, Mamie Van Doren was the product that exposed its cynical machinery. After Marilyn Monroe became a sensation at 20th Century Fox and Jane Mansfield was created as her replacement, Universal decided they needed their own platinum blonde bombshell, leading to the creation of Mamie Van Doren's career. Critics didn't just pan her. They used her as evidence to indict the entire studio system. If Monroe is champagne and Mansfield is beer, Van Doren is the stale water left in the bottom of a glass, wrote The New Yorker in a particularly vicious review of Untamed Youth, 1957. What made Van Doren different from our other subjects was how nakedly artificial her creation was. There wasn't even the pretense of acting ability, just a cynical calculation that audiences would pay to see another blonde with measurements similar to Monroe's. Universal executives were completely open about it, recalled a casting director from the era. "In a planning meeting, I heard the head of production literally say, 'We don't need her to act. We need her to stand there and let us photograph her from these 3 approved angles.'" Directors developed almost comically straightforward techniques to work around Van Doren's limitations. One common approach was to have her deliver a single line, cut away to another actor's reaction, then cut back to Van Doren with a different camera angle, creating the illusion of a continuous performance that never actually existed. She couldn't act her way out of a dressing room. A cinematographer who worked on several of her films told Vanity Fair in a 1998 retrospective, "Our strategy was simple. Keep the camera moving, keep her moving, never let the audience focus too long on any one moment. The Hollywood Reporter was particularly brutal, describing her performance in Girls Town as stiff, awkward, and laughable, noting that emotional scenes appear to physically pain her, as though she's struggling to remember both her lines and what emotion she's supposed to be feeling. Yet despite critical savaging, Universal kept pushing Van Doren as a star throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. Her films, often exploitation pictures or B-movies, were profitable enough to justify her continued employment. When compared to Monroe's nuanced comedic timing or even Mansfield's committed performance style, Van Doren represented the point where Hollywood's blonde bombshell assembly line finally produced a product too synthetic for even the most forgiving audiences to accept. But if Van Doren was manufactured without concern for acting ability, our next subject proves that even male dramatic leads could be cast primarily for their jawline rather than their talent. John Derek, the man who couldn't express emotions, but married women who could. John Derek's path to Hollywood stardom should have been simple. With a chiseled face that combined the best features of Cary Grant and Tyrone Power, Derek was personally selected by legendary Columbia Pictures head Harry Cohn to become the studio's next leading man. Cohn invested millions promoting him, casting him opposite established stars, and placing him in prestigious productions. There was just one insurmountable problem. Derek had one expression for happiness, sadness, fear, love, anger, everything, confided a cinematographer who worked on multiple Derek films. His face just didn't change. Directors would joke, he looked like he was thinking about nothing. The critical response was savage. The New York Times wrote that Derek stares intensely at his co-stars, presumably to indicate thought. Unfortunately, the intensity of his gaze is inversely proportional to the apparent depth of his performance. What made Derek's limitations particularly glaring was the company he kept on screen. When cast opposite Humphrey Bogart in Knock on Any Door, 1949, the contrast between Bogart's nuanced performance and Derek's emotional flatness became the unintended focus of every scene they shared. After one particularly difficult day of shooting, Bogart reportedly pulled the director aside and asked, "Is the kid stuffed? Should we check for a pulse?" Yet Columbia kept pushing Derek as a dramatic leading man throughout the early 1950s to increasingly diminishing returns. Variety eventually noted that Derek gives the same wooden performance he's given in every film to date. The camera loves him, but he responds with all the emotional depth of an attractive hat stand. But here's where Derek's story takes a fascinating turn. After his leading man days faded, he reinvented himself as a director and photographer, becoming famous for showcasing his wives, most notably Bo Derek, in films and photo shoots that emphasized their beauty above all else. John understood one thing better than anyone: the power of a beautiful image, said a producer who knew him well. He couldn't create emotion with his own face, so he built a second career capturing it in others. In a strange way, Derek's career came full circle, from being exploited for his looks by the studio system to creating a personal empire based on exploiting the looks of others. The man who couldn't express emotion on camera built his later career on photographing women who could. While Derek's limitations came from emotional flatness, our next subject faced a different challenge entirely, one that ultimately became an unlikely success story through sheer determination.
I was 8 or 9 years old. He'd walk alongside of me and hit my body to knock it in the street and the traffic was going by.
Tony Curtis, from Yonda Lies to Castle to Oscar nominee. Sometimes the problem isn't a complete lack of acting ability, it's being spectacularly wrong for the roles you're given. When Tony Curtis, born Bernard Schwartz in the Bronx, began his career at Universal in the late 1940s, he had every physical attribute the studio wanted: wavy black hair, startling blue eyes, and a physique impressive enough that his first roles often required him to appear shirtless. There was just one problem that became immediately apparent when he opened his mouth. Tony brought the accent of the Bronx to ancient Arabia with a consistency that would be admirable if it weren't so jarring, wrote the New York Times, reviewing his performance in The Prince Who Was a Thief, 1953. Curtis became infamous for a line delivery in the 1952 film Son of Ali Baba, where his Brooklyn accent transformed "Yonder lies the castle of my father" into what sounded to audiences like "Yonder lies the castle of my fatta," a moment that became legendary in Hollywood as an example of miscasting. Cary Grant, after working with Curtis on Operation Petticoat, reportedly quipped, "I'm told Tony Curtis does an excellent impression of me. Too bad I can't return the compliment. I can't do an impression of someone who doesn't exist yet." The extraordinary disconnect between Curtis's contemporary urban accent and the historical or exotic characters he portrayed created moments of unintentional comedy that critics pounced on with particular glee. "Watching Mr. Curtis attempt Shakespeare," wrote one reviewer of an early television appearance, "is like watching someone attempt brain surgery with a butter knife." But here's where Curtis's story diverges from most on our list. He decided to do something about it. Unlike many beautiful actors content to coast on their looks, Curtis embarked on an extraordinary campaign of self-improvement. He hired voice coaches to help tame his accent. He studied with acting teachers. He lobbied for roles that played to his strengths rather than exposed his weaknesses. "Tony was the only actor I ever worked with who would come to set on his days off just to watch and learn," recalled director Delbert Mann. "Most pretty boys just wanted to hit their marks and collect their checks. Tony wanted to become great." The transformation wasn't immediate, but by 1957, Curtis delivered a genuinely strong performance in Sweet Smell of Success, playing a character whose outer charm masked inner ruthlessness, a role perfectly suited to Curtis's particular qualities. His crowning achievement came with The Defiant Ones, 1958, where his performance opposite Sidney Poitier earned him an Academy Award nomination, an outcome that would have seemed impossible to critics who had savaged his early work. He became decent, but critics never forgot where he started, noted film historian David Thompson. That's the curse of a bad first impression in Hollywood. Curtis's journey from critically reviled pretty boy to respected actor offers a rare counterexample to the pattern we've seen. Through determination and self-awareness, he overcame his initial limitations to build a career based on genuine ability rather than just appearance. But while Curtis fought to improve his acting skills, our next subject's limitations seem to stem from a different source entirely, an analytical, scientific mind that approached acting like a mathematical formula rather than an emotional art.
You wrote it.
No.
Did that hurt your image in Hollywood?
I don't know what is an image.
Hedy Lamarr, the beautiful genius who couldn't emote. Hollywood has seen many unusual paths to stardom, but none quite like Hedy Lamarr's. After appearing fully nude in the controversial Czech film Ecstasy, 1933, Lamarr escaped her controlling first husband in Austria and managed to secure a contract with MGM based almost entirely on her extraordinary beauty. Studio head Louis B. Mayer promoted her as the most beautiful woman in the world, and few disagreed with that assessment. Critics, however, noticed something missing in her performances. "Miss Lamarr undeniably photographs like a dream," wrote the New York Times in its review of Algiers, 1938. "Unfortunately, she delivers dialogue as though she's simultaneously calculating differential equations in her head." This observation was more accurate than the critic could possibly have known. Unknown to Hollywood and the public at the time, Lamarr was a legitimate scientific genius, whose mind was often occupied with complex technical problems. During World War II, she co-invented a frequency-hopping technology designed to prevent torpedo guidance systems from being jammed, an innovation that eventually became foundational to Bluetooth, GPS, and Wi-Fi technology. Hedy approached acting like a mathematical equation, recalled a cinematographer who worked on several of her films. She would hit her marks perfectly, say her lines exactly as written, but something was missing, that indefinable human quality that makes a performance feel alive. MGM's solution was ingenious. Minimize her dialogue and maximize moments where the camera could simply capture her extraordinary beauty and repose. In many of her films, the script required little from her beyond looking stunning, while more accomplished actors carried scenes emotional. Working with Hedy was like working with the Mona Lisa, director Jacques Tourneur reportedly said. Magnificent to look at, but you wouldn't ask the Mona Lisa to cry on cue. Critics frequently use terms like cold, mechanical, and waxwork to describe her performances. Time magazine wrote that Lamarr moves through emotional scenes with all the passionate involvement of someone reading a shipping manifest. The disconnect between Lamarr's extraordinary mind and her emotional limitations as an actress creates one of Hollywood's most poignant ironies. The industry valued only her beauty, completely missing the remarkable intellectual gifts that would eventually earn her posthumous recognition from the scientific community. She was a genius, but not on set, noted a film historian specializing in Golden Age actresses. The tragedy of Hedy Lamarr is that Hollywood only valued the least interesting thing about her, her appearance, while completely missing the remarkable mind behind the beautiful face. Later in life, Lamarr acknowledged this disconnect with a famously bitter observation: "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." The quote revealed her understanding of how Hollywood had valued her, for her ability to be a beautiful object rather than either a complete performer or the brilliant inventor she actually was. But if Lamarr's story is tinged with irony and missed potential, our next subject's career follows a more traditional Hollywood narrative, from promising newcomer to cautionary tale in record time.
They seem to have mastered the art of mental telepathy. I don't understand it yet myself, but she was sending me messages.
Sonny Tufts, the man whose name became a punchline. In 1943, America needed heroes, both on the battlefield and on the screen. With many of Hollywood's established male stars serving in World War II, studios were desperate to find new leading men who could fill theaters. Paramount Pictures believed they had struck gold when they discovered Sonny Tufts. Tall, handsome, and boasting an aristocratic background as a Yale graduate from a prominent Boston family. His initial reviews were promising. Variety called him a find after his debut in So Proudly We Hail, 1943. But as quickly as his star rose, it fell, as critics and audiences began noticing something fundamental about Sonny Tufts. He might have been the worst actor ever signed to a major studio contract. Mr. Tufts delivers his lines as though he is encountering both the words and the concept of human speech for the very first time, wrote the New York Times in a review of his 1944 film, I Love a Soldier. What makes Tufts unique in Hollywood history is how quickly he went from promising newcomer to industry-wide joke. By the late 1940s, his name had become shorthand for bad acting in Hollywood circles and beyond. The transformation was cemented when the satirical radio program It Pays to Be Ignorant made Tufts the punchline of a recurring joke. When asked a simple question, a character would respond with the non sequitur, "That's like asking, who is Sonny Tufts?" implying that Tufts was so insignificant or terrible that merely mentioning him was absurd. The joke spread beyond radio. A 1947 Warner Brothers cartoon featured a character reacting to shocking news by exclaiming, "Suffering Sonny Tufts," a reference contemporary audiences instantly understood as mockery of his terrible performances. Behind the scenes, Tufts' career was further undermined by increasing alcohol consumption, which made his already wooden performances even less reliable. Directing Sonny was like trying to get emotional responses from a particularly stubborn tree, recalled director Mitchell Lyson. After his first few films, we stopped giving him complex emotions to play. Happy or sad became the full range of what we could expect. Paramount continued casting Tufts in progressively smaller roles until 1948, when they finally released him from his contract. His career never recovered, and he became one of Hollywood's cautionary tales, a leading man whose limitations became more obvious with each performance. The studio thought they could create a star by putting a handsome man in front of a camera, explained a former Paramount executive years later. With Sonny, they discovered that audiences might be initially attracted to good looks, but they won't keep coming back without some evidence of talent. But while Tufts' story followed a familiar Hollywood narrative of rise and fall, our next subject took a truly unprecedented path, walking away from the industry entirely at the height.
I'm late, but I locked myself in the bathroom and couldn't get out.
Dolores Hart, the star who chose God over Hollywood. Some Hollywood stories end with faded fame or career reinvention. Dolores Hart's ends in a monastery. In the late 1950s, Hart seemed positioned for major stardom. Beautiful, wholesome, and landing high-profile roles opposite Elvis Presley in Loving You, 1957, and King Creole, 1958, the young actress appeared to have a promising future ahead of her. Critics, however, saw problems that audiences might have missed behind her striking appearance. Miss Hart possesses undeniable screen presence, wrote Variety reviewing her performance in Where the Boys Are, 1960. Unfortunately, emotional moments seem to mystify her. She reacts to tragic news with the same pleasant expression she uses when ordering lunch. What made Hart's case unusual was the gap between her public reception and critical assessment. While audiences responded positively to her wholesome image and genuine beauty, industry insiders increasingly noted her limitations. She was miscast in almost everything. noted a film historian who studied Hart's brief career. Studios kept trying to make her Sandra Dee or Natalie Wood, but she had neither Dee's perky energy nor Wood's emotional range. There was something oddly detached about her performances. Directors who worked with Hart developed techniques to work around these emotional limitations. One common approach was to pair her with more dynamic co-stars who could generate emotional energy that would seem to include her by proximity. The camera loved her face, but the microphone revealed her limitations, explained a cinematographer who worked on one of her films. She photographed like an angel, but couldn't convincingly express complex emotions. Then came the moment that shocked Hollywood. In 1963, after starring in 10 films in 5 years and earning a Tony nomination for the Broadway play The Pleasure of His Company, 24-year-old Hart made an announcement that left the industry speechless. She was leaving Hollywood to become a nun. Hart entered the Benedictine Abbey of Regina Laudis in Connecticut, eventually becoming Mother Dolores Hart, the only nun who is a voting member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. While her decision was driven by genuine religious calling rather than career frustration, some film historians have suggested that Hart's struggles with the emotional demands of acting may have contributed to her feeling out of place in Hollywood. Acting requires accessing and displaying emotions on command, explained a biographer who studied Hart's life. For someone with a contemplative nature, that requirement can become exhausting if it doesn't come naturally. Hart herself has never suggested that acting limitations played any role in her decision to leave Hollywood, describing it entirely as a spiritual calling. But her brief career remains a fascinating case study of a performer whose emotional limitations were overlooked because of her extraordinary beauty, until she made a choice that rendered those limitations irrelevant. In a 2012 Oscar-nominated documentary about her life, God is the Bigger Elvis, Hart reflected, "I never felt I was leaving Hollywood. I felt I was going into something more significant and more meaningful." While critics might have questioned her acting ability, no one could question the authenticity of the choice that defined her life, making her unique among our subjects for finding a path where her particular qualities were perfectly suited to her chosen role. But if Hart chose to leave Hollywood on her own terms, our final subject represents a star who was aggressively promoted, despite overwhelming evidence that the experiment wasn't working.
You used your company dishes tonight.
George Nader, the studio creation who couldn't convince anyone. Sometimes a studio's determination to create a star defies all logic and evidence. In the early 1950s, Universal Studios was developing new leading men to meet audience demand for fresh faces. Among their most heavily promoted discoveries was George Nader, handsome, physically imposing, and possessing the square-jawed good looks that screamed leading man to studio executives. Critics, however, saw something else entirely on screen. "Mr. Nader certainly photographs well," wrote the New York Times, reviewing his performance in Six Bridges to Cross, 1955. Unfortunately, when required to express any emotion stronger than mild contentment, his face takes on the panicked look of a man who's forgotten his ATM password. What makes Nader's case particularly interesting is how aggressively Universal continued promoting him despite consistently negative reviews. The studio placed him in major productions, arranged prominent publicity, and positioned him as a rising star, even as reviewers used terms like forgettable, unconvincing, and dead-eyed to describe his performances. "The studio wanted a star. The screen got a mannequin," remarked a veteran character actor who appeared in several films with Nader. George was a genuinely nice fellow who looked exactly like what central casting would send if you asked for handsome leading man. The problem was that he couldn't make you believe he was actually feeling anything. Directors developed straightforward techniques to work around Nader's limitations. The most common approach was to minimize complex emotional scenes and maximize moments that showcased his physical presence, resulting in numerous scenes of Nader running, fighting, or standing stoically, while others carried the emotional weight. Watching Nader attempt to convey inner turmoil, wrote one particularly brutal review, is like watching someone try to start a fire by rubbing two ice cubes together. Lots of visible effort, no discernible result. Despite Universal's continued promotion, Nader's career never reached the heights the studio had envisioned. By the late 1950s, he was appearing primarily in B-movies and television, his limitations as an actor having become too apparent to sustain A-list status. What gives Nader's story an additional layer of complexity was revealed decades later. Like Tab Hunter, He was gay at a time when this would have immediately ended his career if discovered. The constant pressure of maintaining this secret while trying to project heterosexual romantic interest on screen added another challenge to his already limited emotional range. He was acting every moment of his life, recalled a close friend years later. The exhaustion of that daily performance may help explain why his on-screen work often felt disconnected. Nader eventually found a surprising second career as the star of a series of German thriller films in the 1960s and 70s. Away from the intense spotlight of Hollywood and with lower critical expectations, he developed a comfortable niche that suited his particular qualities. Sometimes the problem isn't the performer, it's the fit, noted a film historian who studied Universal's star system of the 1950s. Nader was never going to be Rock Hudson or Tony Curtis, but in the right context, with appropriate expectations, he found his place. Thank you, members.